The suitcase was already packed when I got home. Not my suitcase. My mother had packed it. Two bags sitting by the front door of the house I had lived in for 6 years, with my things inside them. Not everything. Just enough to make the message clear. On top of the larger bag was a single post-it note in my mother's handwriting. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. The house smelled like it always smelled. Coffee and the particular fabric softener my mother had used my entire life. The television was on in the living room. I could hear it. A laugh track, distant and absurd. My brother Marcus was sitting at the kitchen table. He didn't look at me when I came in. He was looking at his phone, jaw set, performing the body language of someone who has been wronged. My mother came in from the hallway. She was wearing the expression she wore when she had made a decision she knew was painful, but had convinced herself was necessary. Tight around the eyes, soft around the mouth. The look of someone performing reluctant certainty. She said, "I think it's best if you stay somewhere else for a while." I said, "What did he tell you?" She said, "Marcus told me what happened." I believe him. That sentence, 4 words at the end of it, "I believe him," was the most honest thing my mother said to me that entire week, because she meant it. She did believe him. She had always believed him reflexively, automatically. The way you believe the weather forecast without questioning the methodology. Marcus said something. Therefore it was true. Therefore, I was standing in a doorway looking at 2 bags that contained my life. I picked up the bags. I did not cry. I walked back out the door. And I thought, okay, if this is how it works, then let's find out what the truth actually looks like on paper. To understand what Marcus accused me of, you need to understand what Marcus was like. Not to excuse what happened. Nothing excuses what happened. But because context matters. Because the accusation didn't come from nowhere. It came from a very specific place, and that place had been building for years. My brother is 26. I'm 31. We grew up in the same house in Sacramento, raised by our mother, Patricia, after our father left when Marcus was 4. Single mother, 2 kids, not much money, a lot of stress. I understand now as an adult what that cost her. What I didn't understand until much later was what it had produced. It had produced a household with one rule above all others. Marcus came first. Not stated. Never stated. But present in every resource allocation, every conflict resolution, every moment when my mother had to choose between 2 children and chose the same one every time. I was older. I was a girl. I had my father's temperament, which my mother sometimes said admiringly, and sometimes said like it was a warning. I handled things. Marcus needed handling. By the time I was in my mid-20s and had come back to Sacramento after a few years in San Diego, a relationship had ended. Money was tighter than I'd planned. My mother had offered the spare room, and I had accepted. The dynamic was so old it had become structural. It wasn't something that happened anymore. It was something that simply was. Marcus had been living at home for 2 years by then, working a part-time delivery job and pursuing what he called his music career with an intensity that never quite translated into actual progress. He had a studio set up in his bedroom that my mother had funded. He had a car my mother helped pay for. He had, in the way of people who have always had things provided, a remarkable sense of entitlement to continued provision. I paid rent. Marcus did not. I did most of the household tasks. Marcus did not. I contributed to groceries. Marcus occasionally ate what I bought without asking and replaced nothing. I said something about it once, the groceries specifically, well, because it was the most concrete example, and Marcus told my mother I had attacked him over food. My mother called it a misunderstanding and asked me to be more patient with him because he was going through a lot. I absorbed it. I always absorbed it. I had been absorbing Marcus's behavior into my patience for so long that my patience had become a load-bearing wall. Remove it, and the whole structure wobbled. Let me tell you a few specific things I absorbed, because I think specifics matter more than generalizations when you are trying to understand a pattern. When I was 24 and had just started my job in healthcare administration, I needed a small loan to cover a security deposit on my first apartment. Not a gift, a loan, with a repayment plan I had written out on paper. My mother said she was stretched too thin. I figured it out another way. 6 months later, Marcus needed money for a new recording equipment. She bought it for him outright. No loan, no repayment plan. Just, here. I found out because Marcus told me, not to rub it in. He genuinely didn't understand why it might hurt, which is its own kind of painful. He said, "Mom got me the new interface finally." Casual. Like it was weather. When I was 27 and going through the end of a 3-year relationship, I called my mother twice in the first week. She was sympathetic, but brief. She had things going on. Marcus was dealing with some stuff. She'd call me back. The callback came 5 days later and lasted 11 minutes before she mentioned something Marcus needed. When Marcus broke up with a girlfriend he'd been seeing for 4 months. Whoa! My mother drove to his apartment and stayed for a weekend. I am not listing these things to perform grievance. I am listing them because they are the architecture of what happened in March. The accusation didn't land on neutral ground. It landed on 30 years of established pattern. 30 years of my mother choosing Marcus's account, Marcus's needs, Marcus's emergencies. The accusation worked because the groundwork was already there. All Marcus had to do was speak. The believing had already been done. The accusation came on a Thursday evening in March. I had come home from work to find Marcus and 2 of his friends in the living room, loud, in a space that was supposed to be shared. I asked, politely, I am very clear about this politely, if they could keep it down because I had to be up early. Marcus told me to relax. His friend laughed. I went to my room. An hour later, I heard Marcus on the phone in the hallway, just outside my door. He was talking to my mother. She had been at her sister's that evening. And I heard him say, "She came in screaming at me in front of my friends. She shoved me. I think she's losing it, Mom. I don't feel safe." I sat on the edge of my bed and felt the blood leave my face. I had not screamed. I had not shoved him. I had spoken 6 sentences in a normal voice and walked away. There were 3 witnesses in the living room who had watched the entire exchange. But by the time my mother came home 40 minutes later, the story had been told, accepted, and calcified. She had not called me to ask what happened. She had not waited to get home and hear both sides. She had heard Marcus's version and made her decision. And by the time she walked through the door, she was already carrying the packed bags in her mind. The physical packing was just the formality. I believe him. 4 words. 20 years of groundwork underneath them. I stayed with my coworker Jess for 2 weeks. Her apartment was small, and she gave me her couch without making me feel like a burden, which is the particular grace of a good friend in a bad moment. I went to work. I ate. I slept badly. I called my mother twice. She answered once and said she needed more time to process. I did not call Marcus. There was nothing to say to Marcus. I want to tell you what those 2 weeks were like, because I think people imagine that when something like this happens, you spend your days in dramatic turmoil, crying, unable to function, consumed by the injustice of it. That is not what it was like for me. What it was like was quieter and in some ways stranger than that. I went to work and did my job well, because my job was something I controlled, and doing it well was one of the few things in that period that felt solid. I ate dinner with Jess most evenings, and we talked about normal things, her relationship, a show we were both watching, the particular aggravations of our shared workplace. On the surface, I was fine, and the surface was not entirely a performance. Part of me genuinely was fine, in the specific way you can be fine when a long-anticipated blow has finally landed, and you realize the landing, while painful, did not destroy you. What was not fine was the thing underneath. The slow, grinding recognition that this was not an anomaly. That my mother had not had a lapse in judgment or a bad week or a moment of stress-induced poor decision-making. She had done exactly what she had always done. She had heard Marcus. She had believed Marcus. She had acted on Marcus's behalf without stopping to ask whether it was true. And she had done it so reflexively, so automatically, that I don't think she had experienced it as a choice at all. It had felt, to her, like simply responding to the facts. That was the thing that kept me awake, not the injustice of the specific incident, the depth of the groove. What I did instead was think. Carefully, methodically, the way I had learned to think when I was a kid. And the only reliable tool I had was the ability to assess situations clearly and decide what to do with the information. The accusation was specific. He had said I shoved him in front of witnesses. That was not a vague complaint about my attitude or my tone. It was a claim about physical contact. A claim that, if anyone took it seriously, had actual consequences. For my living situation, obviously, but potentially for more than that. I worked in healthcare administration. My record mattered. Marcus had not filed a police report. He hadn't gone that far. But he had told my mother something that she had treated as fact, and my mother had told at least 2 relatives, because my aunt had texted me with the particular careful phrasing people use when they're relaying information they're not sure they should relay. "Oh, honey, I heard there was some trouble at home. Are you okay?" Which meant the story was moving, and stories, once moving, acquire momentum. I made a decision. If Marcus wanted to claim I had been physically aggressive, then I was going to create a paper trail that established exactly what had happened on that Thursday evening. Not to punish him, to protect myself. I filed a report at the Sacramento Police Department. Not against Marcus. I had not been assaulted. I filed what's called a civil standby documentation request, combined with a formal statement about the incident, specifically the false account Marcus had given my mother and apparently others. I documented the timeline, the witnesses, the exact words I had used, and the exact words Marcus had used on the phone that I had heard through the door. Then I contacted 2 of the 3 friends who had been in the living room that night. I knew one of them, Derek, who had gone to high school with Marcus and had always been reasonably decent to me. I explained the situation. I told him what Marcus had told our mother. I asked him directly whether that matched what he had witnessed. Derek was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's not what happened at all. You were totally calm. He exaggerates things sometimes." I asked if he would be willing to write a brief statement to that effect. He agreed. The second friend also agreed, less enthusiastically but clearly. He didn't want involvement in a family dispute, he said, but he wasn't going to lie about what he saw. I had 2 witness statements and a dated police report documenting my account of the incident and Marcus's false characterization of it. Then, I waited. I did not go to my mother immediately. I want to be clear about that. Because I think the timing mattered. Going to her immediately would have looked reactive, like I was defending myself in the heat of the moment, which she would have framed as further evidence of instability. Waiting gave the situation time to breathe. It gave my mother time to sit with the choice she had made. And it gave me time to make sure that what I brought her, when I came, was not emotion. It was evidence. 3 weeks after the bags by the door, I asked my mother to meet me for coffee. Neutral location. I chose a place near her office, comfortable for her. Nothing she could read as aggressive. She came. She looked like someone who was bracing for a difficult conversation, but was committed to remaining in control of it. We sat down. I ordered. She ordered. For a few minutes, we talked about nothing. The way families do when they're circling something they can't yet name. Then I put 3 pieces of paper on the table. The police report, the 2 witness statements, a printed copy of the text messages between Marcus and my mother from that night, which my mother had shown me months earlier during an unrelated conversation, and which I had photographed on my phone without knowing I would ever need them. I said, "I want you to read these. I'm not going to say anything while you do. Just read them." She looked at the papers for a long moment before touching them. Then she picked up the first one. I watched her face while she read. I had spent my entire life learning to read my mother's face. You learn, as the overlooked child, to monitor the emotional weather of the people who hold power over your circumstances. I could see the moment she reached Derek's statement. Something shifted around her eyes, a small tightening, then a release, like a knot pulled too tight and suddenly given slack. She read all 3 pages. She set them down. She picked up her coffee and held it without drinking from it for a long moment. Then she said, These boys say you didn't shove him. I said I didn't shove him. I asked everyone to keep the noise down and went to my room. She said, Marcus said. I said, Mom, read the text messages. She looked at the third sheet. Her own words back to her, her responses to Marcus's account that night, the speed with which she had moved from what happened to, I'll take care of it, the complete absence of any message that said, let me talk to Rachel first, or are you sure that's what happened? She put the papers down again. She looked out the window for a moment. When she looked back, something in her face had changed. Not dramatically, not the cinematic collapse of a mother reckoning with her failures. Just a small, quiet deflation. The particular look of someone who has been confronted with something they cannot argue with and has decided for once not to try. She said, I didn't call you. I said, no. She said, I should have called you first. I said, yes. She said, I've done this before, haven't I? It wasn't a question exactly. It was more like something she had known for a long time, surfacing in a form she couldn't push back down. I said, yes, for as long as I can remember. The silence between us was different from the silences we usually had. Not uncomfortable, not charged with unresolved tension. Just quiet. Wah. The quiet of two people sitting with something true. My mother called Marcus that evening. I was not there for the call, but she told me about it the next day. Told me, I think. Because she needed me to know that she had done it. That she had held him accountable in the specific way she had never held him accountable before. She told him that she had seen the witness statements. She told him that what he had described to her was not what had happened. She told him that she had made a decision based on his account, and that decision had been wrong, and that she was going to tell me so directly. Marcus's response, apparently, was to get angry, to say the witnesses were lying, to say I had gotten to them first and influenced their accounts, to say, with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged by the person he was speaking to, that he knew what had happened and she needed to trust him. My mother said, I have always trusted you, maybe too much. She told me later that the call had ended badly, that Marcus had hung up on her, that she had sat in her kitchen for an hour afterward feeling a particular kind of grief that she described as the grief of seeing something you helped create. I didn't say anything to that. There was nothing that needed saying. I moved back into the house 3 weeks after the coffee meeting. Not because everything was resolved, it wasn't, and pretending otherwise would have been a different kind of dishonesty, but because my mother had asked me to come back and had said clearly that she understood she had made a mistake. And because I had decided that what I needed from her was not perfection but honesty, and for the first time in a long time, she was being honest. Marcus had moved out by then. Not because my mother asked him to leave directly. It wasn't that clean. But the dynamic had shifted in a way he felt and didn't like, and rather than adjust to it, he had relocated to a friend's place and was, according to my mother, figuring things out. I did not celebrate that. It would have been easy to celebrate it. The favored sibling displaced. The overlooked one returned. Some kind of cosmic rebalancing. But that was not what had happened, and treating it as if it were would have missed the point entirely. The point was not that Marcus left. The point was that my mother had, for the first time, looked at the pattern instead of individual incidents. Had seen the shape of it rather than arguing about the edges. That was what I had needed. Not Marcus's removal. My mother's vision. We're still finding our way. I want to be honest about the ongoing nature of it because I think false resolution does a disservice to people who are living through the real version. My mother and I have had more honest conversations in the 4 months since the coffee table papers than in the previous decade combined. Some of those conversations have been hard. There was one, about 3 months in, where she told me she had known on some level for years that she had treated us differently, and that she had told herself it was justified because Marcus was more vulnerable, and that she understood now that telling yourself something is justified is not the same as it being right. That conversation left both of us quiet for a long time. There was another one where I told her about small things, specific moments I had carried for years. The time I was 15 and had won an award at school, and came home to find her on the phone with Marcus's school about a problem he was having, and she had said, "That's great, honey," without looking up. The time I had been sick for a week at 22, and she had called once. The time I had asked for help with a deposit on my first apartment, and she had said she didn't have the money, and 4 months later had helped Marcus buy new equipment for his studio. She listened to all of it. She did not defend. She did not reframe. She said, "I hear you. I'm sorry." All of it. That was what accountability sounded like, it turned out. Not speeches, not tearful confessions, just, "I hear you. I'm sorry." All of it. I want to tell you about one more moment because I think it matters. About 6 weeks after I moved back in, I came home from work on a Friday evening to find my mother cooking dinner. Not unusual, she cooked most evenings. But she had made my favorite, a specific pasta dish she used to make when I was a kid and had not made in years. There was no occasion. There was no anniversary or birthday or reason. She had just made it. I stood in the kitchen doorway looking at that pot on the stove and felt something in my chest move in a way I wasn't prepared for. Not a dramatic wave of emotion. Something smaller and more precise. The recognition that she was trying. Not perfectly. Not with full understanding of everything it would take to rebuild what had been eroded. But trying. In the specific language of a woman who showed love through feeding people, she was trying. I sat down at the kitchen table and she put a bowl in front of me and sat across from me. We ate and talked about ordinary things. Her week, my week, a neighbor's situation she'd heard about. Normal conversation. The kind families have all the time without thinking about it. At the end of the meal, she said, without preamble, without leading up to it, "I'm glad you came back." I said, "I'm glad you made room for the truth." She nodded once, and we cleared the table together. That's not a Hollywood ending, but it's a real one. And real, I've learned, is worth more than perfect. Marcus and I have not spoken. That may change eventually. It may not. I am not holding on to anger about it. Anger is expensive, and I have spent too much of my life paying costs that were not mine to bear. What I have instead is a clear understanding of what is required before I am willing to spend time and trust on someone, and Marcus has not met those requirements. When and whether he does is up to him. I've thought a lot about Marcus in the months since everything happened. Not with bitterness, with something closer to sad understanding. Because I think Marcus learned something in our house too, just a different lesson than I learned. I learned that I had to earn my place by being capable and undemanding. Marcus learned that his place was guaranteed regardless of what he did. And in some ways, that lesson is its own kind of damage. The person who always gets rescued never develops the muscles to rescue themselves. The person who always gets believed never learns to care whether they're telling the truth. I don't know what Marcus's life looks like right now. I know he is at a friend's place. I know, from what my mother mentions occasionally, that he is still pursuing his music, still between jobs, still in the particular holding pattern of someone whose environment has always absorbed the consequences of his choices before they could fully land. I don't know when or whether that will change. What I know is that it is not my problem to solve. It has never been my problem to solve. I just spent 30 years, being trained to think it was. What I know is that I am not waiting for him. I am not organizing my peace around his choices. I am not. For the first time in memory, building my sense of safety on something that depends on my brother's behavior or my mother's reflexes. I am building it on something steadier, on evidence and honesty, and the knowledge that when the truth is documented and delivered clearly, it cannot be indefinitely ignored. Not by anyone. Not even by the people who spent decades looking away. Here is what I want to say to anyone who has ever been the one a family member lied about, who has stood in a doorway looking at their own packed bags while someone who was supposed to love them chose a version of events that was easier than the truth. You are not obligated to absorb it quietly. You are not required to wait for your family to eventually come around through some slow, undirected process of self-reflection. that may or may not happen in your lifetime. You are allowed to create a record. You are allowed to gather evidence. You are allowed to put 3 pieces of paper on a coffee table and say, read these, and mean it. Not as revenge, as accuracy. I think about the version of myself that existed before the police report. The version who would have sat with Jess on that couch for 2 weeks and then gone back to my mother and said something soft and careful. Something designed to make peace rather than to make truth. The version who would have allowed the incident to become another absorbed grievance, folded into the stack of grievances I was already carrying, eventually compressed into the vague background weight of a life spent being managed rather than loved. That version of me would have gone back on my mother's terms. Would have said something like, I know you were in a difficult position and meant it as an offering of peace. Would have returned to a house where Marcus still lived, where the pattern still operated, where the next incident was already scheduled by the simple fact that nothing had changed. I did not want to be that version of myself anymore. I had been her for 30 years. She was tired. The version of me that filed the police report, tracked down the witnesses, printed the text messages, and sat down at a coffee table with 3 pieces of paper. That version was not cruel. She was not calculating revenge. She was simply refusing to let a lie about her become the official record. She was insisting that the truth exist in a form that could not be easily rewritten. That is not cruelty. That is self-respect. And it took me 31 years to understand the difference. The truth does not require drama to be effective. It requires documentation. It requires witnesses. It requires someone willing to deliver it clearly, without apology, to the people who need to see it. That person can be you. It was me. And the moment I stopped waiting for someone else to see what had always been true and started making it impossible to unsee, that was the moment everything changed. Not because my family became perfect. They didn't. Because I stopped needing them to be perfect in order to know my own truth. That's the ending. Not a movie scene, not a family around a table with everything healed. Just a woman who picked up 2 bags by a front door, found her evidence, and came back on her own terms. And knew for the first time exactly what those terms were. So tell me, has someone in your family ever told a story about you that wasn't true? And watched the people who should have known better choose the story over you? Because if they did, I want you to know something. The truth was always on your side. You just needed to give it the right frame. Paper, witnesses, a table, coffee, and the willingness to finally stop protecting the people who never protected you.